complements well your remarks. And I would actually like to start with saying that I like the way that you differentiated between the old nuclear world, and that's basically Europe to a large extent, and the new nuclear world. And yes, Russia is in the middle. And in fact, the Russian policy in Europe is generally toward the West is quite different from nuclear policy toward the East. But I do actually think that there is a dividing line. Yes, there is Russia, so there is the West. Yes, the fence is there. Unfortunately, the end of the Cold War has not removed that fence. I will not go into the history of how it did not happen. That might be quite interesting, but will take us too far from the topic. I'd actually like to cover very briefly 4 issues. One is the general arms control basically seen in Europe before the Ukraine crisis. Then I will say a few words about the role of nuclear weapons in the Ukraine crisis. Yes, and here I will actually disagree from you, with you. Then a few words about the Russian nuclear policy. If there's anything else, I'll try to add a few things here. And finally, a few words about the NATO policy following Ukraine crisis. So the scene, look, as we've seen it before the ongoing crisis, well, it's really been like a deadlock in terms of arms control. The deadlock has existed for a very long time. Although you always see various speeches, talks, initiatives, studies, it really, during the 3.5 years in Vienna, I took part in way too many studies and seminars on tactical nuclear weapons in Europe. And yes, I really got quite bored with them because it was exactly the same things that were said there. Nothing really changed. And in my view, nothing actually will change because everyone in Europe seems quite comfortable with the deadlock. It really satisfies everyone except a few of NGOs. But in fact, as long as you got the deadlock, you can actually get some funding to conduct seminars. So, well, it really works so nicely for everyone. The beauty of the situation is that nuclear weapons really do not have defined missions in the European context. The US military says they don't really need these bombs. They're there. Yes, in fact, yes, the role of B-61 bombs is primarily political. What do you mean political and psychological role? Well, in fact, very simple. Small children sometimes need a teddy bear to fall asleep. So B-61 bombs have been the teddy bear for the few members of NATO who just want them, like in Europe, just to be there. In Russia, in fact, well, it's quite actually similar. If you look very closely at Russian nuclear strategy, tactical nuclear weapons don't really have a role. With one important exception of naval tactical nuclear weapons, all right, but these have a more actually global role. People tend to make the same mistake again and again, thinking that the limited nuclear use in Russian nuclear policy equates with the tactical nuclear weapons use, and that's not exactly right, because the limited nuclear use is primarily associated with strategic and intermediate range, in fact, weapons, not tactical. So the reasons for that deadlock, that we don't have a movement, are primarily political. These weapons, like, are a nice teddy bear. They can be used as a lever to extract concessions of another front, and that's really what Russia is trying to do all the time, to exploit the interest of NATO in the reduction of Russian tactical nuclear weapons. Is if we try to attack these weapons, like on the arms control side, we'll really find that we don't have the tools to do that. We don't really know how to write a treaty that would be quite actually sensitive and difficult and painful in many ways. So these weapons are just there. So that's been kind of the situation for a long time. I would say at least since the late 90s. So what has now changed with the Ukraine crisis? Is that here is, I think I'll disagree with you, Bruno, because I do not really see a role for nuclear weapons in that crisis. Yes, I agree, they're probably present somehow, like in the backs of the minds of policymakers. That's certainly true. But the real criterion is, if you try to decide whether nuclear weapons play the role, is really simple. Will Russian policy be any different without nuclear weapons? Would NATO response be any different if Russia did not have nuclear weapons? And would Ukraine's response be any different had Ukraine had nuclear weapons? And I would say actually no. Basically, I do not see NATO, especially the European NATO, doing anything differently in giving a different response to Russia had Russia being a non-nuclear state. I cannot really see a lot of change in terms of supplying arms to Ukraine or sending troops. So fundamentally, it's the same challenges, the same constraints, and the same caution to a large extent that would have, in my view, dominated decision-making in the West. For Ukraine, the response to Russia, is a response has been quite actually inefficient and poor, is primarily defined by the state of domestic politics in Ukraine following the Maidan and the very sorry state of Ukrainian armed forces. Once again, I do not really quite see how Ukraine could have employed nuclear weapons to the specific tactics, the mode of operations that Russia undertook. So in my view, yes, maybe in the back of the minds, but not immediately affecting the course of the crisis. If we talk about the Russian nuclear policy, yes, absolutely. Russia has been anything but modest in flaunting its nuclear status. Lots of talk, many statements, launches of missiles, yes, exactly. Yes, and of course, launches of missiles were timed to key stages in the development of the crisis during the past year. But if you actually look closely, the number of launches of missiles has not changed. Well, at least not much. They were timed in a different manner, but really it's the same types of launches to test new systems or to confirm that old system still work. Research and development programs and deployment programs are actually the same. They were not enhanced. So the only thing that really changed was the intensity of air patrols by heavy bombers. The only thing that could be really done on the cheap. So it's quite interesting that Russia has been extremely loud about its nuclear weapons. But the words have not been really matched by actions and commitment of resources. Yes, they talk a lot about new weapons throughout last year, but it's exactly the same programs that had been launched way before, in fact, the Ukrainian crisis. Yes, and I would really say there is primarily domestic component to that talk. It's not just domestic, of course. They do like to remind the West that they got nuclear weapons, but to a large extent that has been domestic actually policy. The Russian public loves nuclear weapons. They just love it. Well, I think it's the only country where the public is overwhelmingly in support of nuclear weapons, and the more the better, basically. It's almost like impossible to sell the Russian public some deep reductions of nuclear weapons. It's just impossible to sell the Russian public some nuclear disarmament. So yes, that's kind of, to a large extent, it's really been reassurance of the Russian public that don't worry, this whole crisis, yes, we actually that we got the ultimate deterrence, and to boost support for the government, for Putin, for the military, like everything. So yes, it's really like a little psychological role there. When we talk about the message that goes to the West, I don't really think it's so much about, it's more about supporting kind of what Russia has been doing in the last year. Because in the end, the Russian policy on events in Ukraine is not so much about Ukraine itself. It's a challenge to the international system. Russia's been quite unhappy about the way that the international system was shaped after the end of the Cold War, because it's not happy about the way the international system operates. That's basically a statement that Russia wants to change the rules. So nuclear weapons, nuclear status do support that claim. That's in my view. So the role is not a utilitarian kind of to support a specific policy, but rather kind of very broad and a long-range kind of role for nuclear weapons. So if we actually talk about the military dimensions of the Ukrainian crisis, I would in fact pay attention to conventional weapons. So when we talk about the future, the Russian move from nuclear to conventional capability is the most important thing. Because in fact, it's more dangerous for NATO than Russian nuclear weapons. I've been actually talking about that for several years now. People still tend to concentrate on nuclear weapons just because they're not so visible. But just imagine the NATO-Russian relationship when, not if, but when, Moscow has the same type of capabilities, of conventional capabilities that the United States used in Iraq, in Libya, and other places. That would be a whole actually different ballgame. And Russia actually is moving toward that capability. In my view, it will get operation capability in this sense by the end of this decade. You might even say that in Ukraine, actually, Russia jumped the gun, moved too early. And the final point, really very quick, when we talk about NATO, one thing I would like to add to what you said is that I think the Ukrainian crisis means that the debate about American B-61 bombs in Europe is now finally over. The 2010 strategic concept, the Deterrence and Defense posture review did not quite close the debate. And there was still some countries, especially the basic countries, that continued to discuss whether these weapons should stay in Europe, and whether they will spend the money to replace DCAs and things like that. So I think that the Ukrainian actual crisis means that the debate is over. B-61s will stay, will be replaced. And DCAs will be extended. Well, I mean, the service will be extended, and then they will be most likely replaced. So in my view, the nuclear dimension of the Ukraine crisis has only one tangible consequence, and that's kind of the end of debates in NATO on nuclear policy. Thank you.
What I'm going to suggest, because I know Bruno would like to comment, and I would lead to Nikolai's comments again, I'm going to give them the opportunity, and they respond to questions, to comment as they would like on each other's presentations. But let me begin by providing those of you in the audience who have listened to the talk to ask any questions that you may have. Fine, and I'll call upon Drew, and you may just introduce yourself to Bruno.
Sure. My name is Andrew Brown. I'm a research associate here at the Center for Nonproliferation Studies in the International Relations and Nonproliferation program. I'd like to thank Bruno for his assistance and engagement with me over the past couple of weeks on a number of issues, and he's been very helpful, and we hope he comes back to California very soon. My question is to Nikolai. You mentioned that Russia is seeking parity or will approach parity with the United States in terms of, and NATO perhaps, in terms of conventional forces. I wonder if you see that as an opportunity for the United States and Russia to once again sort of do the disarmament dance together. Thanks.
Should I respond now, or?
Why don't you respond? That's fine with me. Who wants to?
First of all, I don't think that the term parity is the right term. Is actually the Russian capability will be quite different in its shape. If only because for us, the main targets are in Eurasia, very, very far. Russia, in fact, has got many of the same targets in mind, but they're much closer. So in terms of ranges, actually, there will be more emphasis, I think, on intermediate range capability. There will be less emphasis, I think, on the naval component, is a more land-based component, and when we in fact talk about the INF Treaty, or the future of the INF Treaty, I have my explanation about the violation charges, but generally speaking, for about 10 years, actually, the Russian military has wanted to withdraw from the INF Treaty, but not because they want nuclear weapons in that category, they want conventional weapons. In this category, they do have this preference for land-based missiles. So it's not quite parity, just the capability to support foreign policy with military power to a much greater extent than they can do now, to enhance the reach. is including standoff, including a short reaction time and things like that. Yes, opportunities for dance, that's only theoretical. Yes, in fact, the Russians have talked about the need to do something in terms of arms control about advanced conventional weapons. Something that was not part of the CFA treaty, something that's not really subject to the Vienna document. Is unfortunately, it's primarily the United States that has said no. I believe that's a mistake. I believe that's a result of the habit of living for 20 years with a monopoly on advanced conventional capability. And my concern is that when the Russians and Chinese too, in fact, they also tried to do the same thing, and the Indians, by the way. So when other countries will acquire that capability, when the monopoly will be lost, then finally, like in Congress, they will wake up. But at that time, it will be the other countries, including Russia, that will say no. I think that we do have a window of opportunity now, but the window is quite narrow.
Bruno, do you want to comment on this?
On this particular point or on previous points made by
Well,
Nikolai?
why don't we pause for, if you didn't want to comment on this immediate point?
Sure.
I'll have an opportunity, please.
Thank you. This is Faisal. I come from Pakistan. I'm a senior citizen fellow here. My question is to Bruno. You talked about like there is the UK and France. They also perceive a threat from Asia. We know that what United States and their officials think about Chinese nuclear capabilities. What is the French and the view from London on the Chinese abilities to strike Europe and its impact on the European security? Thank you.
Perhaps we should use this. There's no question that we have noticed China's long-standing ability to reach European territory. And it's difficult, if you are a responsible policymaker, it's difficult to do as if nothing happened if a country which is not an ally, which is viewed as a potential threat by some of your friends and allies, can reach your territory with nuclear weapons. Again, that's one of the reasons why we thought that, for good measure, it was not a bad idea to have our own missiles able to target any non-allied nuclear-armed country. That does not mean that from Paris' standpoint, or I suspect from London's standpoint, from that matter, that China is a threat, a direct threat to Europe. It's not. It is a potential threat to some of our friends and allies, and it is a country which behavior in its immediate neighborhood, in particular at sea, does not seem to most of us as being consistent with generally accepted norms of behavior, in particular at sea. Does not mean that it's responsible for any possible tension in the region, but certainly Chinese naval provocations are something that are being watched very carefully in Europe, not only for strategic reasons, but also very simply that any major crisis in Asia would have huge global financial and economic repercussions. So it's our own interest indirectly. Yes.
And Malacca Straits.
Yeah, including Malacca Straits.
A number of comments, Bruno, to some of the things you said. 56, I think it was, you understate what about 56. I think 56 is when you make your real decision to have nuclear weapons. I mean, before that there was a drift, there was all sorts of plans, but I think if there was a moment, historical moment, which France essentially said, it would have been different. It was 1956. Also, I think historically, Bulgarian threats that today looks like totally bluff and obviously no credibility whatsoever, this was not fully the case in 1956. There was a great deal of uncertainty what it means, what do they have. So historically, I think it's easy to make fun and to ridicule Bulgarian state threats today, but it was a little different then. One question I have, following listening to you, is, or two sets of questions, about France itself, but also in Europe in general. To what extent the interest in disarmament, the idea of disarmament, nuclear disarmament, that we had, about 7-8 years ago, it was inspiring, is essentially gone from the face of the continent. I know that in France it never caught anyway, but it's essentially gone philosophically, ideologically, politically. What's your assessment about that? And the other semi-factual question about France is, and to what extent it have impact about the future of the French nuclear force, is the question of the budget and how much it costs, to what extent there is interest in that in France. And obviously one of the things that you did mention in the context of the comparison between the UK and France is obviously your love to secrecy, to nuclear secrecy. I think that...
Seriously?
Secrecy.
Seriously, secrecy?
Yeah.
I'll get back to that.
Okay. I think that Israel and France are those people who love secrecy, unlike the UK. I think here there is fundamental ideological difference of climate between the UK and France.
Can you demonstrate?
I think
Can
the
you
UK
make
is
that
the most
point?
transparent country in terms of nuclear weapons.
What is transparent in the UK, which is not what is not in France?
Numbers, deployments, plans, everything. I mean, in France there is so little public information.
It's not true, but I'll get back to that. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the final question, just as a thought, it's the question of nuclear weapons and the role in terms of stability in Europe. And I think that, and I'm curious to your comment, to my comment, I think a great deal of the question is, what's the role, to what extent the Ukraine crisis is unique, sui generis to the Ukraine, or it's something that under some circumstances could spread elsewhere. I think if you say it's sui generis, then essentially Europe is already settled. Therefore, the role of the nuclear weapon for the ultimate guarantee of stability is not that much. If you worry that the Ukraine situation could spread elsewhere, then indeed you worry about it. So I gave you a lot of little notes, so I'm curious.
No, thank you. Thank you, Avner. I love history myself, and we're not going to have an historian's debate, but and I will just make one point which I think is relevant to a very contemporary question about history. I don't think that 1956 is the decision for France. I don't think there was ever. It's may be the most important turning point, but that's a quantitative difference, not a qualitative difference. I've had this debate also with Jacques once. Jacques, I'm sorry, Jacques. Yes. The immense Jacques. Maybe because we come from different backgrounds, but I think what is fascinating with the French nuclear program is that there was never a key decision. 1956 may be the most important of the small decisions. And a few years ago, I was struck by what I thought were almost similarities between the history of the French nuclear program and the history of the Iranian nuclear program. What I saw in the Iranian decision-making process is little decisions being made, gates being opened, funds being allocated, authorizations being given. And just like, gee, that rings a bell. You know what I mean? So, and I actually wrote a 2-pager about that a few years ago.
I wrote about that too.
And I think that's important when experts like yourselves, Bill and others around this table, try to understand, and they do a great job at it, how countries make decisions about nuclear weapons. And there are sometimes examples where decisions are not made. Decisions with a big D are not made. Decisions with a small d are made, which ended up amounting to a decision with a big D. So that's, in a sense, why I think that history part is interesting. Disarmament gone, yes and no. You're absolutely correct. I mean, saying that the whole global zero movement never really impressed the French. But I think that they like to think that disarmament is not, it's not an either-or question. It's a step-by-step approach, as they say. The French profoundly dislike the so-called humanitarian dimension movement. I personally think that they're wrong and that they should have participated in the conferences. That's one of the rare differences that I have with the French government. But what they challenge is the idea that there will be there's a need for major pushes. No, it's a step. They believe, rightly or wrongly, that nuclear disarmament is by nature should be, it can only be a step-by-step question. On budget, the French budget is 3.5 billion euros a year. You may have noted that there was a speech by what?
3.5 billion. That's it.
The French nuclear budget. Yes. What?
Still it.
It is the whole budget. It's the whole budget. It's the whole nuclear weapons budget. No, I can guarantee you.
It's weapons or including
everything.
Submarines.
Everything except the conventional role of Rafale aircraft, that sort of thing. When Rafale goes to Mali, the cost of maintaining and operating that aircraft is not out of the nuclear budget. To make it simple. No, it is 3.5 million budget, euros. The Hollande speech is interesting on that particular point because he wants to show that it's not only a burden, financially speaking, but that the possession of an independent nuclear capability has brought a lot of benefits to the conventional part of France's defense, because for a number of reasons, ranging from capabilities to technologies, there is from my point of view, rightly so, by the way, a deeply ingrained belief that it has been as much an asset than a liability for the armed forces in general. That's something that Hollande insists on because it's not always very well understood in France. So, in many parts of the world, there is the debate which amounts to a lot of people in the military saying nuclear weapons cost too much and we need the money for other things. It happens in the UK, it happens in the US, it happens probably elsewhere. And there's a set of arguments, in particular, I would claim for a country like mine, where we've done 99%, 95% of the things ourselves. 95. Which, because nuclear weapons involve a standard of efficiency, of excellence, of reliability, of performance in a number of fields that can be translated to other parts of the defense industry, they've been an asset as much as a liability from a strictly budgetary standpoint. Secrecy, I completely, fundamentally, utterly, totally disagree with you, my friend. I think you would have a very hard time making the case that the UK is much more transparent than France, except on one issue, which is fissile materials.
Which is?
Fissile materials. The French have never said anything, have not said anything about fissile materials since they closed down their facilities in 1985. This was a very deliberate decision. The president of that time, Jacques Chirac, said, because we are closing down everything, because we have a small stockpile, I don't want us to be transparent. And there is very strong resistance in the system to any kind of transparency about our fissile material holdings. Apart from that, you would be very hard pressed, I think, to find an issue where the UK has been more transparent than France. Seriously.
Do you publish white papers and all that kind of thing about various basic issues the way the UK do?
Yes. Yes. You actually have new numbers also in the Hollande speech that just mentioned 3 days ago. Interesting question finally about the Ukraine being a sui generis crisis or not. I don't think it is. I don't know about Nikolai, but I think that from a French standpoint, not only French standpoint, it's this very strange and uncomfortable idea that the European security question has been reopened. We thought it was closed. We thought it was closed with the Balkan Wars, and it's been reopened. And that's a very uncomfortable situation that we have yet to come to terms with. We don't know how much, how far, but it is open once again. That's troubling for us. It does not mean that we're coming back to the days where on the East there was a major power which could be a direct, immediate, and total threat against Europe. No, it's something different. Whether it's a Cold War or not is a different question. It's not.
I'm going to address that too.
If there is a Russian threat, it's not the Cold War threat. And I would just conclude. How much do we have?
We'll go for another 15 minutes.
Okay. So, and if I may, I'll just address just one point. It's interesting that we discuss both NATO nuclear weapons, because neither Russia nor France, for that matter, is directly concerned by the B-61 question. Although I would agree, I would claim that France.
Should I show my U.S. passport?
Yeah,
Because I usually do.
Fair enough. No, it's not only for the sake of discussing this particular issue, is that in terms of what it raises for nuclear policy debate. First of all, when you mention the question of military utility and military necessity are two different things. Some systems may be not necessary, but have some utility. It's two different questions. I like your teddy bear comparison, especially given what's usually said about Russia. It's a teddy bear against a bigger Russian bear. Elaine Baum, who's now, before she joined the Pentagon, used to say that she saw these weapons as being akin to a kind of wedding ring, a symbol, an important symbol. And it's not completely unfair to see them, to some extent, as comfort weapons.
Yes, they are.
That's true.
That's why I say teddy bear.
No, that's, I mean, you do have a point. They make you feel good, they give you, but it's also reassuring in a less infantile way. Because the idea that they may provide some kind of strategic shelter, in a sense. Cold comfort on warm nights. I think it's not completely far-fetched from an Estonian or Polish point of view. Again, but they do see these weapons primarily as a symbol of the American political commitment. That's entirely clear. And I'm not sure that the debate is over. You are right to say that, of course, lobbying for the immediate withdrawal of these weapons from Europe, with good or bad reasons, is not exactly a successful cause these days in Europe. At the same time, I would not bet my money on the fact that this means that automatically European countries would accept that their next generation of fighter bombers will have a nuclear capability, and that it automatically means that they would happily welcome a new generation of B-61s in their nuclear vaults that are in their countries. So I think you are right on the short term. I think irrespective of how the NATO-Russia debate and the Ukraine crisis evolve, it's not entirely predictive of the actual behavior, including for domestic reasons which sometimes have nothing to do with strategic rationality, of what these debates are going to be in a few years in several NATO countries.
You know, Bruno, this is one of these cases where I'd be happy to be wrong.
Thanks.
Should I address maybe
Let's see if we have
question?
another question or two, and then I'll give you the floor, Nikolai.
I've got one. My name is Dave Lyon, and I'm a retired Foreign Service officer, no connection with this except coming to meetings like this, which I enjoy immensely. We've talked about nuclear weapons. I understand that the Russians still have tactical nuclear weapons, but I don't think any other countries do. I don't know if I've got that right, but I remember when I was involved during the Cold War, and the question of tactical nukes was a very real issue in terms of a major conflict, even a minor conflict. And I read at one point that the lack of Western tactical nukes, there's no scalability. We got the big bombs, they've got bigger bombs, and that's it. Now, is that something which adds to stability now, or does it detract from stability in terms of any kind of conflict that begins to go out of control? I'd just be curious in terms of this sort of scalability is probably the best word. It's non-technical words. I'm not an expert on what you guys are talking about. Does that make sense?
I mean, I can weigh in, but I think I'll let the panelists speak before
That's
I.
a dumb question. Just jump on to something else.
Well, first of all, and believe me, it's not the political scientist's responsibility. It depends by what you mean by tactical nuclear weapons.
Okay.
If it's weapons which are under a different command authority, that is, are not controlled directly by the top political leadership, but by theater commanders.
More yield, but again, I don't.
If it's a yield question, I think you can say there is scalability elsewhere. I don't think that currently Western nuclear countries and probably Russia are deeply unsatisfied with the range of yields that they have.
They're not dissatisfied.
I don't think that they are dissatisfied with the range of yield that they have. That's a very broad assessment. Then there is a different layer to the problem. Is about deployment of weapons outside your own territory, such as the B-61 I talked about. That's another possible definition. Then there is a separate debate, which is what's going on right now in South Asia, with both Pakistan and India. Everybody focuses on Pakistan, but India has its own plans and programs, developing shorter range, lower yield options, and with lots of question marks about how would this play out in a crisis. But I don't want to give a blanket answer to the question: do such weapons, if there is such a thing like tactical weapon, do they necessarily subtract rather than add to strategic stability? I'm not entirely sure that you can have an overall blanket answer. I think it really depends. Now, nobody in his or her right mind can seriously believe that 12,000 nuclear weapons on the European territory, in the European theater, was good, was necessary, and was not dangerous. Nobody can believe that. It's absurd. Does this mean that sometimes shorter range and lower yields can add to, or does this mean that sometimes diversity in ranges and yield can add up to stability? Yes, maybe.
To deterrence.
Yes,
It depends.
It depends. But again, it's not. It is a typical analyst answer. It depends on your working definition. If you in any case, I think it's very difficult to make a strong case according to which highly delegative control, that is, weapons which might be assigned directly to theater commanders and lower level theater commanders are not a risky option. They are a risky option. Maybe that's a broad answer.
Thanks. Why don't we take Ferenc, and then I may ask a question depending upon what Ferenc asks. I'll give you both a chance to. Do you want to respond first? You have a question as well.
I won't have any closing statements.
Okay. We will see. Go ahead, Fred.
So you mentioned 1956 and the Suez Canal crisis. There were two very important events that year, which was the Hungarian Revolution. So I'm wondering how the Hungarian Revolution sort of influenced European thinking about limitations of interventions.
About limitations?
Limitations. So for the Hungarians, they felt like, why aren't they being defended by the Europeans? And they might have thought that they would have to that extent. So it's sort of
interesting. It's an interesting question. I am not aware that for my own country the analysis of what happened in Hungary had a direct bearing on our thinking on where our nuclear program should go. And I would be very surprised, and again, maybe Nikolai or Avner or others would want to jump in, if anyone could have expected a country to be a country from the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet bloc, to be protected by, I don't know, was there...
The Eisenhower administration had been kind of broadcasting to the Hungarians that, you protected by our nuclear weapons, and I think they internalized this and expected a very different reaction.
Yeah,
and in that sense, what happened in Suez had a bearing on how the U.S. Was prepared to respond.
Right.
And changed, I think, the calculus.
That's a fair point. Well, let me make just one comment at this point. I think for most of the French political personnel of that time, it was a question of first getting the same kind of status that the British and Americans had. Second, ensuring that we could have an independent foreign policy if needed. But then the balance between the two changed in 1958 when de Gaulle came back to power, because for him, both rationales were as important as the other. He wanted France to be, he wanted no difference in status between London, Washington, and Paris. Very importantly. He also thought that it doesn't matter what President Eisenhower says. It doesn't matter what President Kennedy said. Very nice gentleman, by the way. But a country does not die for another country. You don't threaten to be to incinerate another country at the risk of being incinerated yourself for the sake. Simply put, and I think I've read some of his archives and stuff and private papers. I think it was genuine. He really thought that extended deterrence did not make sense. Whether he was right or wrong is another question. You can say that it's not. We don't care what he thought. By the way, there's a hilarious conversation between Ben Gurion and de Gaulle that I think you uncovered.
1960?
Yes, where he says, where de Gaulle says something along the lines of, why would you need nuclear weapons? I mean, you are protected by the American nuclear umbrella. Duh! It's a classic, because I don't even know whether de Gaulle actually realizes what he says is being genuine. Anyway.
Nikolai, you had
a question actually, Bruno, about the French-British cooperation, on the nuclear weapons complex and the maintenance and everything. Yes, I kind of lost actually track. There was an agreement a couple of years ago.
Yeah, 2010.
Yeah. So, can you say a few words about that?
Yeah, I can, but very briefly so that Bill can
Yes.
Largely for budgetary reasons, France and the UK decided to pool forces in one particular segment of what you call here stockpile stewardship, or its simulation. And we're building a joint facility in France for X-ray, three-dimensional X-ray radiography. It doesn't mean that we're putting everything. The British will have their own experiments, we'll have ours. But this is a symbol of the fact that as time passes, the more we talk to each other, the more we cooperate, the more we realize we trust each other. By the way, I think the British are happy that there is another nuclear weapon state on the continent, and we're pretty happy that there's one. I mean, it's cold and lonely up there, in a sense. I mean, I think there is, on both sides of the channel, we're happy that there's a partner. I mean, a close, medium-sized European partner. And without going much further, I would say that French-British nuclear cooperation is certainly on an upward slope. I mean, it's increasing rather than decreasing in general.
No, I think what I would just would like.
You can actually comment on this,
by all means,
the implications of the Ukrainian crisis beyond Ukraine. The important actually dimension is what you mentioned about it being not completely clear whether the European security question has been open. Yeah, how much? Open. I think that crisis should have happened. Everything was really pointing toward that. It did not have to be Ukraine. It could have happened somewhere else. Starting like in 2012, I would say, is I expected that to be Syria. Like a major clash, really, between Russia and the western Syria. It just happened to be Ukraine. I think that's really the only situation in Europe that we will see. But that confrontation will likely continue outside Europe. I think the Middle East is the most likely that I've seen eventually. Yes, and the problem there is really that, well, as far as Moscow is concerned, actually, European security has not been resolved or closed. In fact, the Balkans wars are really seen in Russia as something that fundamentally skewed European security. No matter how many times European countries and Washington have said that the Kosovo example is not a precedent, it's a unique case. In Russia, they do actually see it as a precedent. And the fundamental issue is, from the Moscow standpoint, the fence is there. That Moscow has remained outside the fence. It's not been consulted, not listened to. And in fact, events outside Europe that played the key role is the war in Iraq, Libya, then Syria. So it's basically wars. It's lots of chaos. Is in the Middle East and Northern Africa. That operations were undertaken against the advice of Russia. They think that the UN Security Council resolution on Libya was misused and so on and so forth. So it's much more about the management of the global security system. Because in Ukraine just happened. Because once again, Maidan did not have to result in the ouster of Yanukovych. Because in that case, actually no Ukrainian crisis, but yes, I suspect that Russia then would have actually supplied arms and perhaps some troops, like in indirect fashion to the Syrian government or something like that.
I think the only thing I would add to this discussion before I ask you to join me in thanking our two speakers is that you kind of ended perhaps on a more optimistic note than I think is merited for two basic reasons. One, we tend to have discounted the potentially very disruptive, I think, and dangerous behavior that may be driven by domestic audiences in both countries. And so, to the extent that it were Mr. Putin, perhaps, and Mr. Obama playing the game with their, French and British and German colleagues, I would be much more comfortable. But clearly in the U.S., you have other players as well who can, I think, quite easily add an awful lot of fuel to the fire that is still, burning rather strongly. But it also relates to something that you touched upon, but we really didn't focus on, and that was, the near miss or the flyovers, the potential for accidents, mistakes, which could escalate, out of hand very, very quickly in this particular, environment. And so, while it may be the case that we're going to be able to treat Ukraine as kind of one-off, I don't think we can assume that that's the case at this moment, and we're still very much in the game. I don't think we're in the end game yet. No. And it can go in a number of ways that would be exceptionally destabilizing. So I hope the optimism that I sensed is in fact merited. I'm not as persuaded that it is. But please join me. I think you were both provocative. I tended to agree with much of what you said, which in a sense was disappointing, Bruno. But I do particularly appreciate your spending time with us, interacting with my staff, and welcome you back very soon. And Nikolai, it was great that you were here to also participate in, I think, a very interesting exchange. So please join me in thanking our speaker.